My name is Ari, and I've been a designer for about 10 years, and so much has changed. You can buy 3D printers on Amazon, there are think pieces on Twitter's new typeface, and free or cheap no-code software makes it easier than ever to design digital products. It's not just visual and product design that has changed. Frameworks and disciplines like design thinking, agile, and user experience design are as commonplace in companies as they are in design studios. Which is to say, design is everywhere. And that makes it more important than ever that the products and systems we design and the processes we use to design them are equitable and just. This idea is in part the foundation of design justice. In short, design justice is a collection of people and practices working to challenge and dismantle systems of oppression through design, especially when design creates those or perpetuates those systems of oppression in the first place. I first came across design justice last fall. It was after a summer of protests and racial reckoning, and for Black people in particular, it was a really traumatic and exhausting time. But it was also inspiring and activating. For what felt like the first time ever, at least in my lifetime, non-Black people recognized the structural injustice and violence our community so often endures at the hands of institutions. Finally, a critical mass of people began demanding justice on the streets, from the government, and in our workplaces. So I wondered, if we consider workplace culture a sort of designed product, how might design justice principles help organizations become more equitable, diverse, inclusive, and just? This presentation will explore that question by evaluating workplace DEI practices through a design justice lens. We'll start by learning more about what design justice is. Then we'll take a look at a few design justice principles and how we might apply them to DEI practices in the workplace. Before I dive in, I want to acknowledge that I'm far from an expert in DEI or design justice. I'm still learning about design justice, and I've only experienced formal DEI efforts as an employee. The vast majority of my expertise comes from my lived experience, and the following ideas come from or draw upon the extensive work upon many, many people, including and especially people from marginalized communities. I've done my best to give credit where credit is due, but please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you think I've fallen short in this area. And finally, I want to acknowledge that this presentation and my personal design justice journey is heavily and significantly inspired by Design Justice, the book by Sasha Kasandzachak. So before we get into the principles of design justice, there are two important concepts to know. One, what we mean by design, and two, what we mean by justice. Well, more specifically, what we need to know is a term called the matrix of domination. First, let's talk about design. By definition, everyone designs. You design. Because design is simply to plan and make something for a specific use or purpose. A design is that something. But not everyone gets paid to design, and not everybody gets credit for the design work they do. And the people who do get the most money and credit for the design work are usually creative directors, design executives, or chief product officers, and they don't really reflect the general population. For instance, an AIGA study found that despite women making up most of the design profession, they are underrepresented at leadership levels. This matters because design is powerful. It has the power to shape culture, behavior, the way we see and move about the world. And despite efforts to universalize design processes, design is never neutral. From how we scope design work to how we evaluate it and create it, design is all done by people with all of our limitations and biases. And when those limitations aren't accounted for and those biases go unchecked, design can and does do real harm. For instance, in 2019, a study found that because most crash test dummies are modeled after men, women were inadequately accounted for when designing car safety features. The result is that women are 73% more likely to be seriously injured in a frontal car crash than men are. The harm design can cause isn't just physical. Twitter ran a study on its own algorithm for cropping photos, and it found that it favored faces that were, quote, slim, young, of light or warm skin color and smooth skin texture, and with stereotypically feminine facial traits. While Twitter's cropping bias certainly isn't a matter of life and death, it does matter what one of the biggest platforms in the world considers important enough to focus on. It makes you wonder what other biases creep into the algorithms that we use every day. Design justice doesn't just ask that we account for these biases in our design processes, it compels us to dismantle the systems of oppression and the conditions that allow these biases to flourish in the first place. Next, let's talk about the matrix of domination. It's a bit academic. Coined by scholar Patricia Hill Collins in her 1990 book, Black Feminist Thought, the matrix of domination refers to the interlocking systems of oppression that, to varying degrees, benefit and burden us all. For instance, racism isn't the only form of oppression that someone can experience. They can also experience gender or class-based oppression or all of them at once. According to Hill Collins, we experience these forms of oppression and we're able to resist these forms of oppression on 3 levels: the personal, community, and institutional level. If the matrix of domination sounds similar to intersectionality, which might be something that you're more familiar with, it's because it is very similar. The term intersectionality was first published in a 1989 paper by Kimberly Crenshaw, another Black feminist scholar, and it similarly provides a framework for understanding how women, or people, Black women in particular, are multiply affected by systems of oppression. Both intersectionality and the matrix of domination are essential to understanding the broader purpose and mission behind design justice. What I like about the matrix of domination is that it gives you those 3 planes, the personal, the communal, and the institutional, from which to experience oppression and to fight oppression. So now that we have a bit of a foundation of understanding for what design justice is, let's dive into the principles of design justice and how we can apply it in real life. In 2015, a group of 30 people developed 10 principles for how design justice can be applied to our processes and practices. I'm not going to go through all 10 in this presentation, but I want to highlight 3 that can be particularly helpful in thinking about how we can apply design justice to DEI. The first principle we'll go over is the first principle of design justice. It reads, "We use design justice to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems." This principle gives us a new way of framing the purpose of both DEI and design in the workplace. For a long time, both designers and DEI practitioners have had to prove the business case for their roles within organizations. And to a degree, it's worked. It's not so uncommon anymore to see both DEI professionals and designers in the C-suite of organizations. But at what cost? In the case of DEI, efforts to prove its profitability can undermine its moral imperative. It's also just alienating for employees from marginalized groups to have to hear about the business case for their existence in the workplace. In a 2020 article for Fast Company, Sarah Kaplan writes that the latest experiments have found that exposure to an organization's business case for diversity decreased a sense of belonging to that organization for women and for members of the LGBTQ community, which was then associated with lower desire to join and lower performance in the job. The business case language has a way of making people feel othered and devalued. Beyond that, the once ubiquitous claims for the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace have come into question. By prioritizing justice, we may avoid some of the pitfalls of focusing exclusively on the economic benefits of diversity in the workplace, not least of which is failure. In Design Justice, Sasha Kasandachak writes that focusing exclusively on the profitability to make the case for increased diversity isn't just ineffective, it misses the point altogether. Quote, "Because design justice as a framework includes a call to dismantle the matrix of domination and challenge intersectional structural inequality, it requires more than a recognition that employment diversity increases capitalist profitability." Next, we're going to look at the 4th principle of design justice. Principle number 4. We view change as emergent from an accountable, accessible, and collaborative process rather than as a point at the end of a process. Let's start with the last part of this principle, that change is emergent from rather than the destination of a process. I think of it this way: change is a means to an end. So you can change your diet, but the outcome that you want at the end is health. Or your goal might be more diversity, which is great, but what's diversity without justice? You could have the most diverse organization in the world that still contributes to unjust outcomes for everybody else in the world. As author and DEI consultant Lily Zhang put it in a recent LinkedIn post, diversity, equity, and inclusion are means to an end. We have to ask ourselves if that end is justice, and if not, what we're creating or complicit in instead. Design justice gives us a bigger goal than just business success. As Kasandachak puts it, That goal is collective liberation and ecological sustainability. To get there, the process must also be just. This is where the first part of principle number 4 comes in. We view change as emergent from an accountable, accessible, and collaborative process. In the case of DEI workplace efforts, this could look like collaborating with employees while you're scoping, designing, and executing DEI programs. Because design justice isn't just about including impacted communities, in this case, employees, during the testing and prototyping process. While it's important to test and prototype solutions with your end users or your impacted communities, what's just as important is working with them when you're shaping the problem in the first place, because a solution to the wrong problem isn't a valuable solution at all. For me, the DEI problem wasn't that I didn't know enough about unconscious bias. It wasn't even that there weren't enough people in the workplace that looked like me, which of course didn't help, but that wasn't the real problem. What I really wanted and needed were clear paths for career growth, pay equity and transparency, and to be included in important meetings that involved my work. And all these things would benefit everyone. But people don't usually ask the most impacted members of underrepresented communities what they want out of DEI programs. These trainings end up usually being, for lack of a better term, for the lowest common denominator. And of course, employees should be compensated for collaborating in DEI program design. Maybe it's financially, or maybe it's in their performance reviews, or both. Regardless, employees should be compensated for their efforts and time and input in designing DEI programs. It's also important that the design process is accountable and accessible, 2 factors that enhance one another and are made easier through collaboration. Transparency is key here. You don't want to wait till the annual DEI report to let employees know what your DEI efforts are. They can only participate in the design process to the extent that they know it exists. This is about making DEI more than an FYI. It's about including employees in designing the problem as well as the solution. Next, we're going to cover the last principle of design justice. Principle number 10. Before seeking new design solutions, we look for what is already working at the community level. We honor and uplift traditional, indigenous, and local knowledge and practices. Though it's often unintentional, designers have a habit of prioritizing their own solutions over the solutions that may emerge from or already exist on the community level. Again, in this case, we're considering employees of an organization, the community level. Rather than designing a DEI solution from scratch or in isolation from employees, help amplify the efforts that may already exist on the ground. Maybe this means supporting or sponsoring existing employee networks. Or maybe it means, like a lot of companies did last summer, matching donations to organizations of employees choosing. But of course, again, this shouldn't be done without asking employees for their permission or without giving them proper credit for their ideas or efforts. The need to meet communities or members of underrepresented groups where they are when designing solutions for them is put really elegantly by Sasha Costanza-Chock in Design Justice. Don't start by building a new table. Start by coming to the table. Ask any designer. A project is never really done, and it's certainly never perfect. The same can be said for DEI. As long as you're taking as equitable steps as possible, you'll be on the right track. Thank you so much to everyone who helped me put this talk together, including and especially my sister Alana and my colleagues at Charter. And of course, thank you to the 3% Conference for having me. Until next time.